Welcome. I'm Chaplain Eric Wester from the National Defense University, and for those of you who are joining us, a special welcome. We had 3 very engaging panel presentations yesterday and some breakout sessions as well. Today's panel 4 addresses the theme, How the Military Learns. And as a brief introduction, I want to offer a short reading from the introduction of a book by Judith Hicks Stein. The book's entitled The U.S. Army War College, and I really like the subtitle, Military Education in a Democracy. Guardians are the armed citizens, police and military, who protect their unarmed fellow citizens. What is important, and perhaps curious, is that although they possess the potential to oppress, guardians instead serve. Why do they do so? How are we guarded from our guardians? One safeguard against oppression is the fact that our military is used almost exclusively outside the United States. Another is the military's division into services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And these services further divide into active duty, guard, and reserve components. Rapid rotation and assignments also prevents our guardians from developing independent bases of power. Perhaps the most important factor, though, is the education of our guardians. U.S. military officers receive a good deal of physical, intellectual, military, moral, and practical education. This begins not as in the days and ideas of Plato in the womb, but before induction at a military academy, West Point, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, through the Reserve Officer Training Corps, and as a civilian, or at a civilian college or university, or thirdly through the Officer Candidate School, OCS. Specialty training occurs shortly after induction and recurs throughout a military officer's career. In about the 10th year of service, an officer who plans to make the military a career attends a command and general staff college that emphasizes the planning and execution of large and complex military operations. In about the 20th year of service, selected officers attend a war college where they learn to manage even larger operations and to think strategically. It is important to note that the curriculum at a war college is not solely concerned with the application of force. Officers also learn how military strategy fits into a more inclusive national security strategy, and they learn how to work with and advise civilian leaders. The War College year is intended to prepare warfighters and to educate strategists. It melds training and education. It is the subject of this book. The education of U.S. officers differs from that of Plato's guardians in one important way. Instead of being trained to accept the direction of a philosopher king who has successfully completed guardian training, demonstrated superior wisdom, and forsworn the pleasures of both private property and family, a U.S. military officer is taught to take direction from a civilian commander-in-chief whose authority comes solely from electoral victory. Our panel today approaches the topic of military education from a variety of experiences and perspectives. I'll be introducing the first 3 panelists, and then we'll take a 10-minute transition break, and then we'll finish with 2 more presentations. The first part of the panel includes Dr. Steve Kime at the far right end of the table, retired as president of the Servicemembers Opportunity Colleges. He served as vice president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, as a division director at the Naval Academy, and as chair of the Veterans Advisory Committee on Education, so he's worked with the VA. He said one of the most important things is that for 20 years, the central element of his contribution to education was serving as the principal DoD liaison about enlisted education to the Academy. Next to Dr. Kime is Lieutenant Colonel David Bolgiano, U.S. Air Force officer, as you can see from his uniform. And Bo, is that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, he said most people call him Bo. Is currently enrolled at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and is a member of the Staff Judge Advocate Corps. He is the Judge Advocate for the Maryland Air National Guard. Immediately after 9/11, Bo helped draft the rules of engagement for Operation Noble Eagle, and I was standing on the lawn of the Pentagon that day and saw the fighters fly overhead, and then the rules of engagement were apparently implemented or designed afterward by you and others. He's twice deployed to Afghanistan, Qatar, and Iraq as a legal advisor to the Commander of Special Operations Command in the CENTCOM area of operations. He's had civilian law experience, and since 2007 is the Deputy General Counsel for the Joint IED Defeat Organization, Counter IED Operational Integration Center, which is the military's efforts to try to protect our warriors from the largest source of coalition casualties. Our third presenter, somebody that you met yesterday, Dr. Shannon French. Dr. French is the director of the Anamori Ethics International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University.
It is a mouthful, isn't it?
It is a mouthful. Yes. And prior to her appointment there as director in July 2008, she served on the faculty at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, teaching philosophy and ethics there. And you'll be familiar with her work, The Code of the Warrior, Exploring Warrior Values Past and Present, where she surveyed a variety of cultures and looked at how warriors are formed, their identity, which includes education as a part of their development as warriors. So we'll begin with Dr. Kime. Steve, you come to the microphone and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me out there? First, I want to say I'm very honored to be here. I really am, amongst the people who talked yesterday, who were pretty darn good, in my opinion, and did reflect a variety of angles on the subject that we're here to talk about. And I'm really, really honored to be among you. Feel a little bit like a marriage counselor in a love-hate relationship here, given the title of what we're about. I certainly felt like a teenager in the middle of a divorce when I was here in the late 1960s doing my doctorate at Harvard, and was, I think, the last person in the ROTC building when they bombed it. I have some experience with ROTC. That was my assigned home while I was here, and with Harvard, and a real affection, in fact, for what Harvard has done in the past, and in my opinion could do more of in the future with the military. There have been some bad times, but I'd like to say right at the outset here that on balance, this is a very positive environment that we're entering. The opportunities are great, in fact, for making some real headway. And I believe that there are some concrete opportunities to do that. I'd like to use my 12 minutes now here to focus on three things, and I'm going to have to rush through them pretty quick to do that. The first one is education and training in the military, and what that means for you. Fundamental change is underway here, has been underway for some time, and directly affects the higher level schools in this country. The second thing I'd like to address are what are the real obligations and opportunities for the Ivies. Concretely, what is it you could really do? And then third, I'd like to try to connect, and I don't know whether I'll succeed at this, the notions that are in this planning for this session here. Military systems of higher education, military associations with academia, and evolution of leadership mindsets. All those things need to be tied together at this conference, in my opinion. The first thing I'd like to say about military learning and how does the military learn, I'd like to be sure I say right up front that they learn just like everybody else. They're smart. The officers are particularly smart, one of the highest qualified groups of people that are brought into the U.S. government. Maybe CIA does better, but the military, these people learn academic stuff just the same way that you do, and there's no question about it. The difference is very important, though. They learn in a very training-intensive environment. And the differences between training and education are key here. Now, I grant you that the differences are not black and white, and you can't separate them completely. But the notion of training to do something, and the notion of education to think about something that you've never thought about before and get it right on the spot, being equipped to do it, not eating a fish, but learning how to fish, all those things that you've heard about, the differences are key in understanding this academe-military relationship. because they're learning in a training-intensive environment where training is king. It not only is king, it should be king. The first order of business is war. Has to be war, should be war. And the second order of business is education and thinking beyond that mission. The mission is virtually everything to begin with. Now, if you have to understand that. Now, is there time for education? Yeah. And do they do it? You bet they do it. How much time, how it's done is very, very important. But there is a difference. There's a constant tug of war in the military. I've talked to military people who basically, when I started in the business, said, why do enlisted people need to be educated? I don't hear from those people anymore. They're gone, thank goodness. But there still are some people around who would spend 100% of our time with our enlisted people especially, not worrying about critical thinking, not worried about understanding things on the battlefield or in a social political situation where they can turn it into a mess in a hurry if they don't assess it right and understand it. Linguistics, linguistic training and that sort of thing not valued. It's possible to do this really wrong. And there are some people who would really try. Because we have training bosses in the military, but we don't have really many serious education bosses in the military. And that's not the way we're set up. Understand that. It's really important. Now, there's a different intensity now about training and education that has evolved over the last 25 or 30 years because war has changed. How we use force has changed. So the proportion of education versus training has changed dramatically for officers. It's the reason why I spent a lot of my life in officer education and at the National War Colleges and even at the Naval Academy. Because the proportion is changing. It is now generally understood that these have to be more educated, if not less trained people. And so the balance is changing. We are in a more socio-political intensive world in political military realms of thought. We're totally in a different world and changing rapidly. The American way of war has totally changed. Not for the better in some ways, in my opinion, but it has changed. Modern warfare and contemporary political military situations have just made the thing different. Now, one of the big differences that I think we've really got to think about here is that it has devolved. It's no longer just senior officers who are at least supposed to be able to think. Some of them don't do that very well, and they certainly don't articulate it very well. But now we've gotten down to the point where an E5 out there, maybe the young man, we talked about the young man yesterday who had come home and he was responsible for the lives of 3 or 4 other young men, and he didn't like to work at Walmart or wherever it was he was stuck anymore. No wonder, because he was forced to think as an educated man. He's an enlisted man. He joined off the slopes of the hills of Appalachia somewhere, maybe. But he's required to be able to think and have critical thinking skills. We need to integrate into what he does more of the socio-political kinds of thinking than we ever before. It is totally different from World War II. Totally, totally different. No longer does the paradigm that we heard yesterday about, well, we create the leaders here at Harvard and at our better schools. And these guys just do what they're told out as the military officers. Well, true, in a democracy, that is the way it works. And the civil military authority structure had better be that way, and nobody I have ever met in my life in uniform would want to change it. But you've got to have Petraeus. You've got to have Bill Crow. You've got to have that Princeton, that Harvard-educated person who reaches the senior levels, and even the middle grade levels in the officer corps at least. How else are you going to write national intelligence estimates that make any sense? And you think the military doesn't participate? Boy, you're wrong there. The influence is huge. And in fact, in Petraeus' case, he was talking way, way above the people who were supposed to be listening on the civil side, let's face it. And so was General Shinseki, as a matter of fact. I see a future where this balance will shift even more dramatically. As we enter into this post-nuclear, post-intercontinental nuclear superpower world, to use a whole lot of the words that we used to use as I was growing up, as we enter into this world, it is more and more nearly going to be true that everyone is going to have to be a sophisticate, everyone in authority in the military. And we have got to understand that the balance of education versus training will change further. And that this directly affects the nation's schools and universities. And I'll get to a little bit more of that in a minute. I'd like to also make a proposal here, a proposition, that this is not only going to be true in terms of our combat operations and our deployments, but this is going to be true in weapons procurement, in research, development. What kinds of vests are you going to need? Gets right down to the nitty-gritty and where the rubber really hits the road. That the fact how we do things and the environment that we do it will affect deployment patterns. It will affect all of our planning, everything. That it will become more political, socio-political, if you will, in the future. As we write that 10-year defense plan ahead, there are real changes of kind involved. And they are toward the academic, in my opinion, and away from the specific operations of the military. And if you don't think that it is important that this will affect weapons procurement and research and all the rest, then you don't really understand the relationship between the military and academia, where the billions of dollars are really going. And it isn't just in maintaining an ROTC program. Okay? It's everywhere, all across the economy. Think about that. Now I'd like to shift gears just a minute to veterans and the obligations and opportunities of academia. The GI Bill has really been about the relationship between the universities, really, and the GI Bill. There is great opportunity in both of these things, both for the person that wore the uniform and for the university. The new GI Bill is a revolution. And it's a revolution that the so-called better schools in this country and their wannabes had better recognize. Because I don't think they really have recognized what a difference this is going to make. It is enormous. All colleges follow the money. That's where all that research money goes and the weapons development money goes and everything else. And don't let your holier-than-thou left-wing professors talk you out of that, guys. That's Harvard wants that money too. And if they want to influence it, they better get on board. Okay? But the yellow ribbon program in the military is really important to the Ivies. Did you know that the new GI Bill, if you can get a young man who is an enlisted person and wants to become, if not an officer, a white-collar person and go to a Harvard or a Yale, did you know that the government will put up most of the money for him to come here if you can admit him? That you could actually attract those people and it wouldn't cost you any more than a token amount of scholarship money? I could give you all the numbers, but I won't do it for lack of time here. But there is a great opportunity for you to participate. And as I said last night in that answer to that one question, the Ivies are not there yet. They have not stepped up. The Partnership for Veterans Education is a group that has worked hard to get a new GI Bill and has worked hard to promote military education and better civil academic military relations. And nowhere are the Ivies present. Nowhere are you letting a minority of a faculty keep you from participating in what is your national responsibility. That's a darn pity in my book. Now, all of these things affect the Ivies, and I'm having to skim through this pretty fast. But understand this. The military system of higher education that you read about, how people get education is not a standalone business. This is an important message I have to give to you. We use all of the parlance of higher ed. We talk of schools, we talk of college, we talk of deans, we talk of students. We use all the parlance, but only to the extent that we in our military education system reflect higher education processes and standards of accrediting our schools and standards of making our professors have to get tenure in a real way, like we did at the Naval Academy. I was part of that. We, only to the extent that we reflect the way academe does business, do we reflect America and American education. That is something that is so important. And it only works to the extent that academe plays, that they get off their tails and up on the step and play in the system. We need professors at the National War Colleges who come in and out of the Ivy League. And believe me, they'll take as much back home as they brought. I guarantee you they will learn more in a year at the National War College than I learned in 3 years doing a doctorate here at Harvard. I guarantee it. I've been there and I've done that. Okay, my time is up. I would like to talk to any of you that I can to expand on these points during the rest of the day. I hope we've done a little bit here to give you some insights into this relationship and maybe a little bit of hope that we could make it a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Well, good morning, and hello again for those of you who were here yesterday and heard me give my other talk. I'm actually going to follow rather directly on your comments because if you heard from the introduction there, I taught at the U.S. Naval Academy actually for 11 years, so just over a decade. And I was in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law while I was there. And this is going to be a little bit of a sales pitch, which is sort of ironic because I just left the Naval Academy, but I'm a little wistful. And I wanted to open with a bit about what it's like to be a civilian teaching at these kinds of schools, and I think it is a bit of a sales pitch. And then I want to talk to you, as my descriptor in the program says, a bit about how it's done at in other countries and how it compares to how we teach at our service academies in the U.S. So when I began at the U.S. Naval Academy, I was a newly minted Ivy League PhD from Brown. Yay, Brown. Anybody? No. Oh, well, I represent. Anyway, and I was in my 20s and looked every bit as young as I was. And in addition to the question I mentioned in my last talk, where my former colleagues from Brown used to say, what's it like to teach at the Naval Academy? I would get from random strangers on an airplane who asked me what I did, what's it like to be a female civilian teaching the code of the warrior at the U.S. Naval Academy? Which is actually slightly more interesting, I think, question. And the answer is that the Naval Academy has an amazing small-town-like feeling to the Brigade of Midshipmen, such that if you establish your reputation with them once, then it lasts. Now, this works in both directions. If you have if you do a bad job and people don't think that you're credible, then it will be very, very hard work, perhaps not impossible, but very hard work to re-earn the trust of the brigade. So I knew that my very first time teaching was very important because thankfully someone had warned me of that. So my first time around, I had a class that was pretty receptive to what I was teaching because let's face it, the Code of the Warrior subject is kind of cool. I was talking about Vikings and samurai and warriors, and plus I used to bring weapons to class. So it was going pretty well. It was going pretty well. But there was this one kid in class. I'll give you his real first name, Chad, because we are now very, very good friends. But Chad was a pain in my neck. And he was always sitting in the back of the classroom in very un-midshipman-like behavior with his arms folded. And they're usually terribly polite, which is part of the sales pitch dream to teach to students this polite. But he was not. He would always look like I was annoying him and wasting his time. Well, so at one point, I accidentally made some reference that kind of gave away my age, as if they couldn't already guess it. And he just burst out and he said, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, you're only a few years older than I am." And I had one of those moments that you rarely get in life where I actually thought of what to say then instead of at 3 in the morning. And I just summoned up, we'd been talking about the Chinese warrior monks, so I think I focused my chi. But I went right up to him and I looked him in the eye and I said, "Yeah, that's right. And I have a PhD. What have you done?" And the whole class, as you might imagine, went, "Ooh." And Chad, who I've said is now a good friend. In fact, he's practically an uncle to my baby daughter and member of the family. He later recounts this story too in pretty much the same way, and he says, and in that moment I became her devoted slave. So it's like, well, that wasn't that hard, but so I stood up to Chad, who was my naysayer, and that was enough for him to say, well, maybe she's got something, and maybe I should listen. But the dream of teaching these students is that, particularly the ones I had in my Code of the Warrior class, who were about to graduate, about to go off and actually be officers, is they were under no illusion about whether or not they needed to have these conversations. They were eager, they were hungry for it. When I talked about how do you preserve your troops' humanity, when I talked about issues of the warrior's code and what courage really means and what war does to the soul, they wanted to know, because it was a very short amount of time before they were going to be in leadership positions. So they did come to class with that open mind and that eager consciousness. And I admit, I miss it a little bit when I think back on my wonderful students. So if any of you happen to be contemplating ever taking advantage of the chance to teach at any of the service academies or war colleges, I highly recommend it, because these are people who come to education with the sense that philosophy and psychology and these abstractions that sometimes you have to convince ordinary undergraduates have any value or any application are actually something they desperately want and need, and they're coming to you for that. So that's a wonderful thing. Now, the other thing I wanted to emphasize, I mentioned this yesterday, is that the Naval Academy being a good example, courses and programs are team taught by people who do have just the straight academic background and no military experience, and those who have served, and then the combination thereof, people who have both. And that, I think, is extremely enriching. And in this course that I've mentioned, the Code of the Warrior, the Academy was wonderful at helping me locate and put into my classes guest speakers who had been there and done that. Because you need that too. I mean, for all that I could potentially bring to the table, there are obvious limits as an academic to how I could address some of these critical issues. So I would bring combat veterans, and I would have them, discuss the issues that were on the table from their own experience. And this was, of course, something that I was not alone in doing. And the best semesters that I ever taught at the Naval Academy, this Code of the Warrior course, were the two that I got to team teach with Master Chief Guild, a 27-year veteran of the Navy SEALs, who is now a mentor at Coronado for each incoming BUDS class. And he and I team taught it, and it was the best semesters I've ever had. So I'll say again what I said yesterday, which is that teaching in that environment with that blend of experience and academia made me a better philosopher and enriched, my development beyond anything I can express here. Now, I did say I would say a word. I've just gotten my 3-minute warning, so let me move on to international ways that these same sorts of issues are addressed. I'll just give a few examples. Australia. In Australia, the system for teaching at their version of the academy is interesting because there again, they're trying to get that blend of traditional academia mixed with the military experience, and to make sure that their cadets and mids get the benefit of both. What they do is, rather than having an integrated academy that has both types of academics and officers teaching side by side, they have their academy side by side with the University of New South Wales. And interestingly, it's a joint academy, so they have midshipmen and cadets at the same academy. They wear their uniforms and they do all their drill and all of their military training, this training versus education question, they do all their training at the academy. But then for their civilian courses, they literally go into civilian clothes and walk over to the University of New South Wales and take classes just like any other student there. And while they're there, the professors, try not to make any distinction for whether their students happen to be cadets or not, although the haircuts give them away. So the idea is that they get the full experience of a college education on the one hand, just like any other college student, but then they walk back over, put their uniforms back on, and they're doing their drill and the focus and learning the legacy. So it's an interesting combination approach that they have. Now, another example I want to give, just because it's unique, is Norway. Norway, sort of similar to the U.S. in the structure of its academies, but what's interesting is they have a huge experiential learning component, particularly in ethics, which I actually think we in the U.S. could learn from and borrow/steal. And that is, they set up throughout the year, several intense exercises meant to mimic actual real-life war combat experiences of various types. And they all have ethics components and ethics lessons woven into them. And I don't mean like the Marines running the Crucible where they stop at different times and read about past stories, which also has value. But I mean they're actually going to be faced with ethical dilemmas in these scenarios. They hire real actors to help with some of the training, just like our military does for other types of training. And I'm out of time here, but let me finish my point very quickly. So I think it's a brilliant way to show again where the rubber meets the road and bring together the academic lessons with the experiential lessons. And I think we could learn from that and borrow some more from that. And they take a lot of time in crafting these exercises so that they're realistic and they're not going to be laughed off. And I got to speak sort of candidly with some of the cadets over there, and they said, no, we really do take it seriously, particularly because if you fail these, it is like failing a course, and you can get kicked out for that. So it has that weight behind it. All right, I will end with that, but I will say one final humorous note as part of my advertisement for teaching for the midshipmen. By the time I had been there 11 years, I was no longer the 20-something, what does she know? They called me the Warrior Queen.
Thank you very much, Dr. French. Bo, microphone is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, when I talked to my friends down at Fort Bragg and told them I was coming to Harvard for this purpose, they said, "Criminy, Bo, I hope you don't set things back 20 years." So I'll try not to do this. Talking about training and education and the difference between the two, I think the succinct way I understood at a very base level the difference between the two, and that is when I send my teenage children to high school, I pray that they get sex education, but I also pray fervently they don't get sex training. But we'll proceed from that because it has some relevance to my briefing on training this morning. I bring you some good news, I think, from the Officers Corps. And I should have obviously prefaced any of my remarks by saying that the opinions I expressed this morning are Bo's, not the United States Air Force or Department of Defense. I think it'll be obvious as we get into this. But I participate on a daily basis at the United States Army War College in seminar discussions with my classmates, Army colonels, Air Force, Marine colonels, civilians, and we have diverse opinions, trust me, violent arguments every day on issues of politics, policy, and the like. That's good news, but I think even the better news is this: when we put on this uniform and go out into the public to do our duty to represent America, we are not Democratic colonels or Republican colonels. And I think that's a very important distinction. And I'm so proud that on 12/01 on January 20th of this year, we had a transition of power unlike just about any other country in the world. And that's a very good thing. What I'm going to talk about now is some ethical considerations on fighting an enemy in this asymmetric threat. And if I can figure it out, I'll probably screw this up too, but let's see.
Use the right button.
Yeah. There we go. All right, some quick historical context of what we're talking about, though. Let's look at the history of warfare in 20 seconds or less. The Assyrians, Sargon the Great, would routinely take all captured enemy officers and leaders, flail them alive, and paste their skins on the walls of his palace. The Roman legions didn't do much better, but they did try to bring some code, not necessarily of ethics, but code of warfare into the fight. The Middle Ages, of course, brought us codes of chivalry. And as we progress up quickly to the 19th century and look at some of the deaths and in the Crimean War and our own Civil War here in the United States, where we lost 26,000 dead on one battlefield, some efforts were made to bring some reason to fighting. Fast forward into the 20th century, you see the Battle of the Somme, 1 million dead, and that's just military. World War II, where the United States policy at a strategic level was to firebomb 175,000 Japanese civilians, killing them. We've come a long way. I can say with confidence that I serve in the most effective fighting force in the history of the world. I also serve in the most ethical fighting force in the history of the world. We spend countless hours poring over operations to make sure to the best extent possible that we limit civilian casualties. That's very important, and I think we have to put this discussion in that concept. The problem is, however, compared to World War II, where the enemy was fairly easily discernible, the Wehrmacht wore gray uniforms, the Japanese Imperial Army wore insignia, the aircraft were marked, and all the way through history, just about, enemies were fairly easily discernible. Now, our enemies are not wearing Al-Qaeda t-shirts. So we're placed, our young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in very difficult situations where, in fact, they are the strategic corporal out there whose actions can have impact on our policy at the highest levels. Simply look at Abu Ghraib, simply look at Haditha, simply look at the targeting decisions when we fire an armed predator in Waziristan. And here's the problem out there we're faced with. This problem has two fronts to it. The first should be obvious. If we're not training people on threat identification, they're not likely to get shot in the face or get hit by an ID up front. That's not a good thing. The other side of that coin is what I would call shooting out of fear, where you have a young soldier opening up with a crew-served weapon and you get 25 dead civilians. Equally not good. The goal of the course that I run and that I've been writing about for over a decade is to do this. We have to understand, however, the dynamics of an encounter. And let me just preface this. If we make a decision to target a declared hostile, we don't have to worry about any of this. If you kill somebody without legal authority, that's murder. We can all agree on that. So what are the legal authorities? The legal authorities is that our political leadership designates certain people in times of conflict. In OIF 1, for example, it's unclassified now. The members of the Iraqi military forces were declared hostile forces. We could target them simply based on positive identification. If we understand where they are and identify them, we can shoot them. The other way is in self-defense. And 99.9% of the engagements on the ground now under that second rubric of self-defense. That is where an enemy or potential enemy presents an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to an American force or a coalition force member. This is very similar to the threats that a police officer walking around the streets of Cambridge. The same legal decisions are being made. And we need to do a better job on training our young forces on this type of concept versus the standard infantry tactics that we see. And let me explain that briefly. If you look at Haditha, And what happened there, the Marines that were in Haditha, most of them were in Fallujah 18 months prior to that, where they were facing an entrenched enemy combatants, where the standard tactic of taking a house down with enemy combatants in it is grenade ins followed up by small arms fire. It's very effective. Move them 18 months later to a civilian populist area, and if you don't train them on how to do a house takedown like a civilian SWAT member would do, you're going to end up with civilian casualties. Folks, that's not the young Marines' fault. If we don't train them on threat identification, I think that we have some problems we can address. The good news is that we are addressing them. And I want to talk a little bit about what we're teaching them. We're teaching the dynamics of encounter, which is action versus reaction. Bad guys out there have to make a decision of when. They preload their OODA loop, that's the observe, orient, decide, and act decision-making process. They preload it, they know when they're going to attack, when they're going to hit the clacker on the IED, and the patrol walking down the street is always in the reaction mode. So the key lesson here is that our soldiers are nearly always behind that decision-making power curve. They have to recognize the threat, choose an appropriate level of response, because all threats don't require a deadly force response, and then their brain housing group has to tell them to implement the response. Action always beats reaction. We have to understand, however, that's not a sterile environment. That decision process is made under sudden and unexpected occurrences. If I'm going into an area where I know there's going to be a firefight, I'm calling Mr. A-10 or Mr. M1 Abrams. I'm not going in there with an M4. But reality is we don't know that. So you're going to have unpredictable movements, limited target opportunities, often under low light situations. And this last one is most important. The life and death stress of a sudden, close, personal, violent encounter. And that leads to certain things that we see in police officers, sensory alteration. All these things happen. I shot as a police officer in Baltimore, Maryland, before I came on active duty, a robber at a McDonald's robbery. During the firefight and afterwards, my partners are yelling, shots fired, shots fired. And I was thinking, man, I didn't hear any shots fired. Then I realized they were talking about my shots. I never heard them go off because of the auditory blunting and exclusion that was going on. All these things happen that we see can disproportionately hurt the decision-making process of our soldiers. We have to understand wound ballistics, how bullets work. A lot of it is we derive from Hollywood. Unfortunately, Hollywood is incorrect. Bullets work very simply. They disrupt the brain nerve function, either by bleeding out the individual or having a direct shot to the cerebral cortex or upper cervical spine. When I hear things like this, all in good intentions, being told to soldiers, use minimum deadly force, how do you do that? And what's happening here is the bottom piece here. We have a concept in our strategic counterinsurgency manual called minimum force. It's a strategic concept. General Petraeus is spot on. If we can take out an individual by patrols rather than dropping a 2,000-pound JDAM, we should do that. It's how we win the hearts and minds. But that strategic concept has no place at the tactical level. If you're confronted with an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, grievous bodily injury, you apply force until the threat's over. So these are all teaching things that we got to teach our young men and women. And how do we do that? We do it by judgment-based training. And this scares a lot of commanders because commanders like control, especially pilots in the Air Force. How to start an airplane, a checklist. Hit switch A. Okay, and if switch A doesn't go on, you have a branching thing. It's very compartmented and makes sense, but that linear thinking does not make sense here. Rules of engagement cards make very poor field expedient toilet paper. They make even less efficacious legal guidance when it concerns this issue. So what do we need to do? We need to teach our young folks under high stress conditions, stress inoculate them, as Colonel Dave Grossman says, so they can make better decisions under stress to see the threat, evaluate it, and eliminate it. Now, I do not mean kill everybody, please. What am I talking about? Come into a building, see a threat. Oh, it's a mom holding a baby. You move on. You've just eliminated that threat. But if we're not teaching folks to make these judgment-based decisions and trusting them to do so, we're going to be in trouble. What else do we need? We need clear understanding of the RUF, rules for use of force authority, and that comes from strong command support. My commanding officer at SOCCENT, General Gary Harrell, signed a policy statement that said this: if any soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine assigned to this command uses deadly force in self-defense, he or she will not be judged in the clear vision of 20/20 hindsight, but rather how a reasonable soldier would act under same or similar circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. I wrote that for him, and he said, "Bo, dang, you're pretty smart." I should have let him think that, but I fessed up and said, "Sir, the Supreme Court of the United States said the same thing in 1989 in a case called Graham v. Connor, in which they applied that law to the judgments of law enforcement officers, federal agents, when they use deadly force." So it seemed to me axiomatic that if that level of protection was given to law enforcement officers here in the States, we should at least give the same thing to soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines under high-stress combat settings. He agreed. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court applied that same standard to Title X forces here in CONUS, continental United States, in a 2001 case called Saucier v. Katz. Not a lot of commanders know that out there. Very, very important to understand that I'm not making this up. General Harrell didn't make it up. This is rooted in our constitutional law, both in the Fourth Amendment as well as the common law concerning use of force in self-defense. We need those strong command supports and switched on legal briefings. General Fuzzy Webster of the Army applied this same standard to 3rd Infantry Division just before they deployed on their second tour in Iraq. 30 days after they deployed, one of their soldiers at a traffic control point outside of Baghdad saw a rapidly approaching Mercedes-Benz automobile that disregarded Arabic and English signs out there saying slow down and stop, warning signs, flares, and as the Mercedes approached, the young trooper opened up, killing the driver and wounding people in the vehicle. Unfortunately, it turned out to be an Italian intelligence officer that was taking a recently released hostage back home to freedom. Terrible tragedy. Horrendous international incident that is still ongoing. General Webster stood up to the plate and said, based upon what that soldier knew at the time he pulled the trigger, and that is the legal standard we must judge our young people by, he said he made the right decision. So we need courage, and we're getting it from our leadership at the top, but we also have to drive through and understand and do a better job of explaining to our civilian population and the international media as a whole the legal standards that apply and why they apply. Training, and this is so important, that the good news, again, I said, is that we can learn to work through high-stress things. And I'm going to do some training with us, and this is a problem, the time to train. Our training calendars, there's not a lot of white space in them. There's not a lot of time in the ramp-up to do it, and this takes time. The training course I teach takes 3 days at a minimum to train our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and it's very difficult to get a commander to give you that time. What we shouldn't do, though, is put lipstick on a pig by ratcheting down on the rules of engagement to keep bad things from happening. First of all, it won't have any effect because soldiers recognize stupid rules when they see them. But more importantly, if we don't take the time to train, I think we've abdicated our duty under the standing rules of engagement to train. Get ready to close out. I want to talk a little bit about the element of chance here. And here at the Divinity School, I tried to paraphrase Ecclesiastes 9:1, probably not too well, but I think this has long been recognized that chance does play a role. We can't affect that, but we can affect everything else. I'm going to finish up with a little training piece that Dave Grossman taught me. Bear with me. I know this is a little touchy-feely, but we're going to do a breathing exercise. I want all of us to breathe through our nose for 4 seconds, deeply from the diaphragm, hold it for 4 seconds, then exhale for 4 seconds. We're going to do 2 iterations, and I'll count off. Ready? Let's start. Let's breathe in. Hold. Exhale. One more time. In. Hold. Exhale. I hope that you felt a sense of peace come over your body. And why that happened is this. We just tricked our puppy brain, our midbrain, which normally takes care of breathing, heart rate, blinking of eyes, all the things that happen subconsciously. Our forebrain, our cerebral part of our brain, tricked that puppy brain, and in doing so, it gave you that sense of calm. What happens under high-stress shooting engagements is the puppy brain tries to take over. That's why you have voiding of your bowels, and it's because the puppy brain says retention of fecal and fluid matter isn't real important right now. All these things that happen, the high stress rate, you can trick your puppy brain. And if you do this before a combat patrol, before an argument before a judge, an argument with a spouse or loved one, you'll do a lot better, and your judgment will not be so disaffected by the hormonally induced stress. We just did some training in here that took less than a minute that could save your life and can certainly save our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines' lives. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Well, the educational enterprise reaches all the way from the military's subordination to civil authority to the tactical level down to our own educational/training experience here this morning.